All right, welcome to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. Today, in a minute, we'll be joined again by Abdaljawad Omar. Very excited for this conversation. As folks know, we've had three conversations now, and this will be a fourth. And this one's going to be a little bit less. I guess they've all been fairly informal, but we're going to kind of take a little bit of a historical look as well as talk a little bit about the development of Palestinian resistance. Um, I'm really looking forward to that. It's definitely something that we need to do more to help people understand, contextualize, see how resistance in Palestine has developed over the years, and very, excited that Abdul Jawad's going to join us for that. Um, Make sure that you do the basic things, like, subscribe, share the video, invite other folks to come watch and listen. And, you could support us, of course, on Patreon. That's patreon.com/millennials are killing capitalism, or by clicking the join button. And happy new year to everybody. I don't know, it's obviously it's again, the subject matter here is not necessarily happy, but it's good to see all of you again, and to be here with you all. Um, for folks who don't know, Abdul Jawad Omar lectures in the Department of Philosophy and Cultural Studies at Birzeit University. In addition to his appearances on our platform and his work with Electronic Intifada, which folks should definitely follow, as well as his various writings. He recently appeared on the Brief podcast, which is hosted by Nora and John from Electronic Intifada, and he has an interview there with John Elmer. I actually listened to after I asked him to do this conversation, but folks should check that out as well because it's a lot of history discussion of the Intifadas, and the development of Palestinian resistance. So we'll kind of be covering some similar ground. Hopefully, we'll get into some areas that they didn't have time for there. And anyways, welcome everybody. Let's get it started. So, Abdul Jawad, thank you for joining me. Welcome to the stage. It's great to see you again.
Thank you for having me, Jared. I'm glad to be with you.
Awesome. So, um, I guess maybe to start, you talk in that episode of the Brief podcast, um, talking about the intifadas, the first intifada and the second intifada, and kind of in some ways you want to disrupt some of the periodization that goes around the way we conceptualize those two things, those two periods. Um, but you also are really interested in looking at um, the way that resistance develops through both of them, and some of the changes in part due to spatial changes, as well as differences in the counterinsurgency that Israel uses during those periods, and kind of what that leaves people with in terms of what they can, how they can resist. So I don't know if you want to start there, if you want to start somewhere else, but that's kind of the first thought that I had.
No, yeah, that's generally what I'm doing in my thesis right now. I should have been working on it, but the past couple of months have left me working on other things that are relevant to it, but not necessarily directly related to it. But anyways, my thesis deals with this kind of phase or historical conjuncture, which is starts with kind of the first intifada. Of course, whenever you start something, it's arbitrary, because even what comes before the first intifada is very integral and important to how the first intifada also develops, and why it develops the way it developed, and how did it conceive its own strategy of disruption, defiance, and attempting to liberate the Palestinian from the control of Israel's spatial domain, to liberate the Palestinian occupied territory, and at least to open up political possibilities at that historical conjuncture. But at the same time, for me, I mean, while working on the thesis, it became very clear, interviewing a lot of the fighters that were involved in the second intifada, and went to prison, left prison, that many of them did not actually have the same conception of the periodization that the historical literature attributes to a first and second intifada. In fact, whenever I was asking about the second intifada, multiple of these fighters who were involved in both would ask me, when did the second intifada start? And that would be a highly problematic notion. Like, for me, I'm just asking about the second intifada, and for them it's like they have no conception of when did this first to the second transformation happened, because for many of them, being involved in the first, continuing throughout the 90s, and then having the second intifada, they saw it as, in terms of their memory at least, as one continuous episode of disruption and violence and also defiance. And it was funny, at some point in one of my interviews, an ex-fighter tells me that oh, you mean when we started shooting? So, I mean, he associated the second intifada with, the militarization of Palestinian resistance. Because for him, as a child, as a teenager, he operated through these small networks around friendship. It was largely, graffiti writing, throwing stones, throwing Molotov cocktails, doing strikes, heating the coals of what was then the unified leadership in the occupied territories, composed of representative of different political parties that would issue communiques, and then people would act out within the spirit of the power of summoning that these communiques had. That was the form of the first intifada, where you had this form of voice, clandestine voice, that would issue communiques summoning people, and then the people were also building their own rhythm of defiance in many ways. And then the UNLA, or the United National Leadership's role, was mostly to basically try to calibrate that rhythm and direct it in different ways through this clandestine collective voice, something akin and similar, if you want, to today's Abu Ubaida in some way, like still clandestine, still not showing his face, speaking with this power of the voice. Of course, it's a different context because he's representing an organizational infrastructure, in terms of Hamas and Kata'ib Izzuddin al-Qassam, and in terms of how they operate on a different plane. But that relationship between the power of summoning and voice was also central. So yeah, I did work on disrupting this periodization, because I think that periodization comes from a different reading of Palestinian history, one highly entangled in notions of victory and defeat. And many Palestinian academics, many Palestinian historians, when they start to speak about Palestinian history, they represented, not because they're making things up. I mean, there's an objective reality where you can say Palestinians were defeated, but they represented it as a series of interlocked defeats. The Nakba 1948, the ethnic cleansing of more than 750,000 Palestinians, or about 1 million Palestinians, from what Israel came to conquer and build itself on. Then you go with the Nexa, and then you have, 1967, when the occupied territories were occupied, the West Bank and Gaza, the Sinai and the Golan Heights. And then you had, a series of other defeats that are attributed to the Palestinian nationalist cause, including, the Oslo agreements, which was described by Edward Said as a Versailles agreement, or akin to Versailles, or akin to the surrender of Germany in the First World War. So in many ways, there's that kind of ruins of history that is presented in terms of successive defeats. And I think one of the mistakes we do is to read defeat as absolute, as unrepairable, as the only way to approach Palestinian history. And this is why resistance can provide a different angle to look at it, to interpret this history as a chains that have endurances and continuities, even within this arbitrary forms of periodization. One of them is the first and second intifada, which we can view maybe perhaps as a big intifada. Even 7th of October we can see as a precursor. It has linkages, it has endurances that comes out of the Second Intifada. So in many ways, you can read the history of resistance, or place front and center resistance as a conceptual apparatus to read your own history in a different light, which tells a different story. It tells a story that, Palestinians were neither defeated nor they were victorious, that they still struggle. And wherever there's will, there's always possibilities, there's always a potential, and that Israel did not succeed because it could not fulfill its settler colonial project in a way that completely shatters or erases the Palestinian presence, whether physical or political or cultural or symbolic. And in highlighting that, we can also approach history from a different light. Why did I do that? Because I think it's also part of the internal struggle within Palestinian society over resistance itself. Because for many, I mean, when they read the Second Intifada, for instance, they see it as a traumatic, of course, it is traumatic, but as a traumatic event, wedded to defeat again, did not accomplish what Palestinians set out to accomplish. And it's used as an ideological tool by the current, for instance, Palestinian Authority to say that the only way forward is to kind of eternalize cooperation with the Israeli state, to make cooperation the only way that Palestinians can enact some sort of policy of survival without enduring the pain of struggle and resistance that would also perhaps shatter their own ability to sustain themselves on the land, or because of Israel's omnipotent power, then it will defeat and crush Palestinians like it has always done. That's the notion. So for me, that was important, is that reading history, Palestinian history, through resistance provides us a different angle viewpoint of how we also read these notions of victory and defeat, and where we at the struggle, and where we can position ourselves as Palestinians, who, in long ago, almost 100 years ago, or even before that, 100, and I always like to say it's since the moment the first settler arrived to Palestine, highly a peasant society that lives mostly either in villages or Bedouin dwellings, and some significant cities here and there, with no real experience in terms of creating, at least saying, the capacity of war in terms of its professionalization, and that comes out of modernity, and the wedding of the war machine with the state. We never had that. We always fought on a different plane and a different realm, or we were tied to some empires that existed and influenced Palestinian trajectories and histories. So sometimes, Palestinians fought, for example, the Ottoman armies, or things like that. But that there's this long history of Palestinian resistance going back to the 19th century, and sustaining itself until today, against this declaration of war that happened on the Palestinian people, the Balfour Declaration. It became very obvious that the intention of the Zionist movement is not to live with, but to live instead, and that the Palestinians had to find a way to start organizing, building the capacity to resist, building the capacity to fight. And therefore, we can also read this kind of interaction between Palestinians and the Zionist state, not only from the standpoint of its victims, like Edward Said wrote, but also from the standpoint of its challengers and contenders. So in many ways, it's also disrupting this, very unidirectional notion of only looking at Palestinians as almost helpless victims, without any form of ability to contain Israeli power, to challenge it, to stand steadfast against it, to use whatever tools, means, techniques, tactics possible to sustain their presence on the land, or to even challenge and disrupt the Zionist state since its formation, or even beforehand. And that goes back even to a Nakba, like, I don't want to talk too much, but you opened your mic, so please go ahead. But, even the Nakba, people, when they say ongoing Nakba, or they say Nakba, it's usually tied to the ethnic cleansing campaign. And although this is somewhat a Zionist viewpoint, I mean, in a sense that Zionists sometimes highlight that it was a war. But the problem with the Palestinians is that sometimes they also forget that it was a war. It was an intense war where they fought bravely. And they had, I mean, Ben Gurion in 1948 stood in the road that, links Jaffa, what is now also Tel Aviv, with Jerusalem, and said the Zionist project is, on the edge. It could also be defeated. So there's that sense of also, in a way, reading our own history almost over excessively as just an ongoing Nakba, which is true. I mean, I'm not trying to challenge that that's not true, that there's a more powerful imperial war happening on a peasant society in an underdeveloped land in a place that still had a lot, of powers coming in and contending and disrupting our rhythms and life and taking away from us the land and and all of these things. But that's not the only story we can tell. There's another story that is also embedded in this type of story that is generally presented when Palestinians speak about Palestine.
Yeah, I appreciate all of that. And so one of the things that you do talk about is the tactical differences. Like, so there's, I guess, one of the things you talk about with John in that podcast is that um some of the folks' experience of the second Intifada was like, oh, this is different. We can't participate in this in the same way as we did in the first. And then there's also, as you referenced earlier, right? There's sort of the reality of, oh, when we started shooting, right? So there's a development of different capacities of resistance as well. So talk a little bit about the dynamics that you think produce those, or produce those shifts between the first and second, in terms of the ability of people to engage in different ways.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I'll just harken back to one point. I mean, we didn't always, as Palestinians, speak about resistance as a concept. It's actually a relatively new concept. When the Palestinian Revolution in 1965 rose, we talked about armed struggle and liberation. These were the central concepts. No, resistance is somewhat wedded a bit to the rise of new resistance movements in the 80s. It included people like Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, who intermingled with the PLO and its different parties and political formations, and then produced their own version, and influenced also by the Iranian Revolution and its Islamic bent. And Hamas has a longer history. It's tied to the Brotherhood, the Islamic Brotherhood, etc. But Islamic Jihad has that kind of deep-seated relationship to the Iranian Revolution. So this type of new resistance, called itself resistance, first of all. And also it's tied to another shift in Palestinian struggle from the Shatat, or the diaspora, to inside Palestine. Now, I need to qualify that, historically speaking, Palestinians always struggled and resisted within the occupied territories. But the major focal point of the political struggle in the 60s, 70s, and let's say the 80s were mostly in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, in other places where the PLO was present and organized itself among the Palestinian refugees who were ethnically cleansed in 1948, turning, as Rosemary Sayegh, she's a Palestinian, also, anthropologist, historian, says, turning the Palestinians from peasants to refugees and then to revolutionaries. And she traces that kind of lineage of the modern Palestinian revolution in 1965. So for a long time, the idea of armed struggle and liberation also had to do with this kind of, being outside of Palestine and attempting a sort of return, while resistance as a concept, has something to do with, facing a concrete power that already controls the spatial domain that you live in, or you live through as well in your daily rhythms, in your daily life, and how you resist this institutional power, this military occupation. So it has this kind of direct relationship in terms of its spatial presence with, Israel's occupation. So it's not by surprise that, resistance as a concept become, one that is generally tied to or wedded uh, to resistance from within, from within the military occupation, not from without. And that has, deep repercussions on, let's say, the idioms of the struggle and how people explain it and how people talk about it, and the discourses they use to describe their own predicament, and their own political possibilities that come with resistance. And resistance, in this sense, has an affinity with a word like sumud, or steadfastness in Arabic, which is the idea of, some people say there's an active sumud, so it's more proactive. Some people, there's a negative sumud, which is just existing, having a bare existence in Palestine, where even in that sense, there's some sort of resistance, because just being and existing here as a Palestinian means that you're disrupting the Israeli state and its fullness and wholeness without you. Like, so there's, the more active, the less active, and there's different pedigrees to it. So then also resistance has this affinity to notion of active sumut. So it's not only, a form of stasis, where you're just sitting and laying down, not doing anything, but there's still some sort of active participation in the forms of struggle. So having said that, the occupied territories in 1967, when Israel entered and dominated the space and erected, different military installations and prisons and police stations, there was a spatial intimacy to the relationship between the Israelis and the Palestinians, for instance, in the West Bank and Gaza and other places, meaning that Israel were inside the cities, were inside, villages. They ruled, the civic realm, the educational realm, the rhythms of economic life. It was a form of direct rule. And in fact, Israel, since its occupation of the Palestinian territory, we're looking for ways to have indirect rule, to not rule directly, because it comes with economic burden. It comes with a lot of burdens that it wanted to get rid of, including the control of, the whole population. And it tried to devise different projects in the 70s and 80s where there would be some sort of self-limited rule for the Palestinians, either based on Orientalist notions of, the big families, the tribes that will come, and then you have the sheikh, the head of the family, that would be, the mediator between Israeli occupation and the Palestinians, or by experimenting, for instance, in 1978 with the Egyptians, with some sort of giving Palestinians autonomy. So in Zionist, at least, conception, they were not really opposed to to the idea of indirect rule. Now, what happens in the first Intifada is that this indirect rule and autonomy in the back, is in the back of Israeli Zionist leadership and planners and heads of the military regime in the occupied territories. And then you have this total revolt of the people, spontaneous. It starts actually in Jabalia, in Gaza. It's, the refugee camp in Jabalia that has been recently on the news and been bombed heavily by the Israeli military. Through what Israel says is an accident, what Palestinians believe was perhaps not an accident. A settler comes in and kills, I think, 6 laborers, Palestinian laborers heading to work within Israel. And it starts this big revolt, a spontaneous revolt, bursts open, and then you have different political formations attempting to organize its rhythm. And, as we talked about earlier, through communiques, through this unified leadership, through strikes, through non-cooperation strategy, this form of, defiance, had many times, a policy of intensification, but sometimes relaxation. You would navigate the Intifada as this kind of pendulum between intensification and relaxation. And the Israelis didn't really have a solution, because non-cooperation strategies meant it was only, the military governor would issue a rule, or would issue a law, and then Palestinians would defy that law, or he would say, or Palestinians will say, strike today, and just closing the stores would be seen by Israelis as defiance of their own authority over, the spatial realm. So in many ways, it was kind of tied to a lot of actions that a wide group of people can participate in. Not opening your store, not going to work, doing things that are kind of that negate the military authority power, but at the same time that you enable a wide part of society to actually participate. Now, of course, the first Intifada also included communes. It included places like cooperatives, educational collectives. It was built about around this kind of counter hegemonic spaces that Palestinians would organize volunteering work, bringing people for face-to-face meetings, defying the closing of universities by doing educational cells clandestinely. Students would meet their professors in a house and have the class without the Israeli military knowledge, and the military would be searching for these students and the professors. It was attempting a form of economic autonomy. There's a famous movie by Amir Shomali about the 18 cows, I think, or 19 cows that were in Beit Sahur, a village in the West Bank near Beit Lahem, where they brought cows and started producing their own milk as a form of also economic defiance. So you had this wide form of experimentation with, let's say, autonomous communist cooperatives and collectives, and building kind of institutional infrastructure for the Intifada itself, and also building an institutional infrastructure that wants to de-link Palestinians, wants actually to separate from the Israelis and build their own self-determination and political future at that particular moment. So in that historical rendition of the first Intifada, this intimacy of the spatial encounter between the Israeli military and the Palestinians allowed for these tactics to become paramount ways of defying Israeli power and control and hold. Now, what happens with the Oslo process is that Israel found a willing partner to conduct what it failed to do before in 1982 and other experiments of indirect rule. It found this battered, revolution, armed struggle, distant in Tunisia, after its expelling from Lebanon in 1982, Arafat and the rest of the Palestinian leadership that were distant. And they were also seeing in the Intifada an opportunity, but also a threat, because it's a threat because it's producing new leadership, new political formations, new organizations. It's highlighting this new, that the PLO had something to do with, but as also was kind of, distant from. And the PLO was interested in returning back to Palestine. And then you had this, the Oslo agreements. And the Oslo agreements set out to have spatial separation as part of its policy. So now you had the West Bank, for instance, divided between Area A, B, C. Area A is where Palestinians have, control over, in the agreements, they have control over security and civil affairs and other affairs. So at least in the 1990s, the Israelis couldn't actually enter militarily into Area A's except in hot pursuit. That's how it's laid out in the agreements. So you had this kind of these autonomous zones, these Area A's that were in major urban centers mostly, and Area B where Palestinians have civil and educational and other control, health systems, etc., but that the Israelis will maintain the ability to enter for security purposes. And Area C, where Israel controlled both the security and civil realm. And of course, Area C was mostly the empty land, but also had a lot of villages and Bedouin communities folded within them. And, Israel was interested in sustaining its settler project in the Palestinian occupied territories. And, the agreements, as everybody renders them, I don't want to go into the history of the peace process, but just for people to have an idea, Israel continued building settlements while at the same time negotiating. So that was one of the reasons why that peace process was not, successful. But indirectly, what that did, at least in the 1990s, is that it created a spatial separation where any form of resistance to the Israeli occupation needs to now start thinking ballistically. It needs to start thinking not in terms of I'm not going to work, or not in terms of non-cooperation tactics, not in terms of also, autonomous creation of institutions, because now you have institutions that are rising that, Palestinians can, build their own healthcare system, can build their own educational system, can build, and of course, not truly, they can't really build them truly on their own because there's a lot of conditions and, for how these institutions operate, who backs them up. We can talk about that, but it's a different story altogether. It's about the political economy of aid, of the development, of indirect rule, and of how Israel still controls the economic development of Palestinians, and also a lot of these institutions shrinking their space through their policies. But at least they had this, autonomous control of. So these strategies don't work anymore. So you have to start thinking ballistically, which means that start thinking about how can I reach a target and how can I hurt that target. That's one part of the element why we see in the 1990s the transformation of the Palestinian resistance from the civil form of resistance and defiance and throwing rocks to start thinking about, how I move outside of these area A's to conduct a meaningful political action or operation, or in Arabic we say amaliyah, in that hurts the Israeli occupation, or that disrupts that occupation and its rhythm and its expansion of settlements, etc. So that's one element. The second element has to do with the first Intifada itself and its own rhythmic, quality. In a sense that it's true that in the beginning years, in the first Intifada, you had the power of summoning and people were participating. But with the intensity of Israel's violence, the intensity of its killing of Palestinians, the economic burden that is arising, accumulating due to the strikes and the inability of the laborers to go to work, slowly that power of summoning for a lot of these, the united leadership starts to dwindle, starts to, it starts to break down. And this causes what I call like a densification in the social organization of resistance. Instead of resistance being this kind of open project that can fold many people into it, from the teacher to the doctor to the trader and merchant, and different stratas of Palestinian society. Now resistance also through this social densification, because some people were saying this is costing us too much. There's an interterminable line socially that starts to separate people from each other. As a result, speaking from the intensity of Israeli violence, and which creates this kind of, people more interested in, small cells, in the intimacy of these relations, in expanding their offensive actions, and, connecting their power of summoning, like what we see with Abu Ubaidah today, announcing to people rather than summoning people. Like he's announcing to the people what the resistance did instead of summoning people to do something. So in many ways, that process is already starting in the first Intifada, even before the Oslo agreements. In fact, a lot of militant formations in the north of the West Bank, unsurprisingly, and in Gaza, would actually arise in the early 1990s, in 1990, 91. There's a lot of examples of these. Some of them are small-lived militant projects, small cells, didn't last for long because they were captured or killed. Others, like Izzeddin al-Qassam, announces itself on the scene in 1992, but it has precedence even before that. So in many ways, there's that process of the social densification of resistance, where resistance now could not just summon people to do an action, needs to also kind of, announce an action that already occurred. And that already has, its first genesis, at least in the occupied territories, in the early 1990s. A third thing, or a third element of all of this process of change, is the return of the PLO, because it's true that the PLO returned on the basis of a peace agreement, or a agreement that supposedly will reach or will achieve peace, but also the PLO returned with some of its own revolutionary professional cadre that had a lot of military experience, that had fought in Lebanon, that had that had this history of knowledge in military sciences, in guerrilla warfare, that Palestinians in the occupied territories generally did not have. So you had this professional cadre that intermingled and intermixed with the local Palestinian society, bringing also this know-how into the Palestinian communities within the occupied territories, and building, if we want, the possibility of also the militarization that we see within the Second Intifada. So we had all these processes happening almost at once, and it leads alongside, the availability of weapons in the 1990s to people starting to create and experiment with offensive political actions. So that meant, bypass road shootings, that meant assassinations, that meant the creation of the human bomb. That meant a lot of the blueprint actually for the Second Intifada, with most of its tactics and actions, was actually built in the 1990s. So if we want to understand the Second Intifada and we see the seeds, the blueprint for the actions that Palestinians mostly used in defiance of the Israel's occupation in the Second Intifada, it already exists in the 1990s through either frontier clashes or bypass road shootings or the human bomb and its use and employment. Of course, it intensifies heavily in the Second Intifada, but it was already there in the 1990s. Of course, it doesn't mean that there was no other links, for instance, with the regional formation that is called the Axis of Resistance, the intermingling of Hamas with Hezbollah, for instance, when a lot of the Hamas leadership was exiled in Majzour in 1993. The trading of know-how and, being inspiration for each other, and then also training. And, these are all part of also the story. It's a big element. There's a lot of other elements to the story of how we go from the first to the second. But when I was studying this and I was looking at it, to me, what is important about the endurances is that many of those that actually were the prime activists in the first Intifada would be the prime activists in the Second Intifada. Many of the leaders of the first Intifada would be also the leaders of the Second Intifada. Many of the people who, established military organization in the 1990s are still today heads of military organizations in Gaza. So there's that kind of also immediate linkage in terms of the personnel, the people involved, and also in understanding that in many ways, resistance responds to that kind of, spatial and temporal world it lives in. And in many ways, in that particular moment, that shift to turn towards ballisticity is not just a matter of choice. It's not just a matter of, as a Palestinian, you're sitting there, oh, we had a nonviolent, as the first Intifada kind of recalled, as a nonviolent, although it's not really nonviolent, but as a nonviolent civic, eruption of defiance, and now people chose to go for militarization. And it's not only because of the intensity of Palestinian or Israeli violence. Of course, it has to do with that, but it also has to do with what is laid out in front of you in your everyday relation to this occupation that allows for people to fantasize about what form of action is possible. And I think this is important because I think fantasy here plays a role. Imagination plays a role. The ability to, construct weapons out of nothing. The relationship between the human and the non-human plays a role. So there's a lot of multi-layered aspects to how this shift happens, and it also will have to feed our reading of these critical, important ways people. Palestinians devised their own defiance, and why these transformations happen. And to me, unlike a lot of other readings, I don't see it as only an inspiration or a desire towards militancy. I think that it really has to do more with the concrete, embodied experience Palestinians face in their everyday life and what form of action appears as possible. And I can give an example from the recent years about that, which is the lone wolf attacks, like what is called the lone wolf attacks, because I think, the necessity of resistance exists, yet you don't have an organizational formation in the West Bank for resistance to be coordinated as a form of collective action. This, for a lot of social, economic, and political reasons tied to the PA, tied to the economy of, consumerism, etc. What's happening in the West Bank in the past 10 years, I don't want to go into it. But at the same time, you're walking with your car, not walking with your car, you're driving your car, in bypass roads, and you see settlers on the side of the road. And I don't think for anybody who's oppressed, there's no fantasy of seeing that settler that is holding a weapon, and boasting of his power in front of you. That Palestinians, when they see that form of image, there's that violent phantasm that comes with it. That's why you see, the relationship, for instance, between fantasy and actually people turning, for example, their cars into, in some instances, into weapons, and driving into soldiers, or these armed settlers. So in many ways, I mean, this form of everyday level is also important in constructing our understanding of how the Palestinian resistance is also symptomatic of the entire system and how it operates, how it tries to find opportune moments within the spatial domain, catching moments where they can crack open the spatial dominance of Israel's military, its settler apparatus, its infrastructure, and its domination of Palestinian lives and trajectories. And that in many ways, most of the Palestinian resistance that emerged in the past 30 years, or even beforehand, are in a way about figuring out forms of action, but then also trying to bind them in forms of rhythm, either through organizational discipline, and then you have collectivities like Hamas or Fatah or PFLP or whatever you want to call them that attempt to organize them, or in many cases it comes out of just a spontaneous need, a psychological also need to feel human through defiance, which harkens back to Fanon and his psychological reading of why the oppressed or the wretched of the earth, use revolutionary violence, etc. I don't know. I talked a lot, so
No, that was great. Um, can you talk a little bit more, because I think you've mentioned something, we probably have talked about it a bit before in some of our conversations. It's funny, after I host these live streams with Abdaljawad, we usually talk for about an hour or so off air, and so that blurs in my mind what we've talked about on and off air. But one of the things that um, you've discussed is this development of cells, and I know we talked about this in one of our conversations earlier about your work around friendship and and kinship and cells. Obviously, also there's questions, around um, that people might have, right? Of, as you said, like, you could have the disciplined organization, you could have, a disciplined army. I'm interested in what you think are some of the different dynamics that start to see the development of cells, and how you read that shift, or that desire to sort of go that route rather than, for instance, joining, some organization, and I guess in some ways give people a little bit of maybe an idea of how do cells then get activated or become involved, or how does that usually work?
I mean, look, there's no one way or entry into. There's no one way for people to enter into a cell. But I think for me, because what part of my research was, talking to dozens of ex-fighters, and then trying to, like, it's not a view from what organizations say about themselves. Like, it's not what Hamas declares, for instance, in its official history, or what Fatah talks about when it talks about its own political history, or what PFLP also talks about. So I was sitting with people and talking to them, and generally people tend to, like, of course, exaggerate their own importance and self-importance in anything. And generally people also tend to indirectly tell you a lot without knowing that they're telling you a lot. And through the research, I didn't go into it thinking that friendship is central. I didn't think that I'll reach a conclusion that I need to write a whole chapter on friendship and Palestinian resistance. But then that I discovered that it's one of it's if the it's one of the central institutions of resistance, that it's one of the central building blocks of Palestinian resistance, historically speaking, not only in the first or second Intifada, but throughout. And even until today, even in how the Palestinian resistance, as an organized, guerrilla movement that has different roles and has technologies and building, it's still friendship is a central component of all of this. Why is friendship a essential component? Because the price of political action in Palestine, specifically if one is not, wedded to, a lone attack, somebody just doing attack by himself, is high. It's life in prison, or it's, being killed. And that's always been the case. No, even now it's even higher. For the West Bank, if you do an attack, now not only do Israeli soldiers will execute you, not only will they steal your body and put it in a freezer in Abu Kabir or bury it somewhere in Numbers Cemetery, but they will also destroy your family's home, who had nothing to do with what you did. And at the same time, they will, arrest your mother, arrest your father, humiliate your family in many instances, etc. So there's a price to be exacted even from your immediate social environment. But beyond that point, because the price is so high, people generally tended to only do actions with people they trust. And generally speaking, people who you trust are, the friends that or the brother that you have, or your cousin, or your childhood buddy that you grew up with, and there's this kind of emotional, intense commitment to each other and affirmation of friendship throughout time. So in many instances, in the development of Palestinian resistance, friendship, either through kinship or close relationships, tying people together, becomes a way of recruitment, of expansion of military organizations, but also of the buildup of cells, even cells that are not tied to organizations. And that's why it's not surprising, for instance, for anybody who's arrested by the Israelis, perhaps the first question a self-respecting Israeli interrogator will ask you is, are you married or not? And the second is, who are your friends? Like, these are the first things that he wants to know, because even within Israeli counterinsurgency outlook, generally speaking, even after, for example, this lone wolf phenomena in 2015, one of the lessons that they published was that we need to monitor the friends, because now what was happening, friends were not doing actions together, but we're following each other. So one friend does an action, then you see another friend following him and doing an action as well. So they started to tie even these lone wolf phenomena attacks with friendship, friends imitating or building some sort of mimicry towards each other, and then conducting attacks in succession rather than together. So they start surveilling. If anybody is killed, they start surveilling his kinship group, his friendship, and all his relationships. So again, just to look back of it, so friendship from that point of view was central because it's a high price, and for Palestinians to be able to do collective action together, where they're certain that the other will not betray them, or the other will not tell on them, or the other will be committed as much as them, then it came out of this kind of sociality of the intimacy of being together and knowing each other very well. And as I said earlier, as this social densification process happens, as this interminable line or indeterminable line crisscrosses Palestinian society, separating them between a more active resistance part and the less active, supportive perhaps of resistance, but also sometimes, unwilling to go all the way. Most people who coalesced around resistance in the 1990s were coalescing around these small cells that were figuring out forms of action together, that were buying weapons together, that in many instances, a lot of cases, would only associate themselves with a political organization after they committed, acts of resistance. So, somebody like Fatah, he would say, I'm Fatah, and then go to prison as a Fatah member, or, something like that, but not necessarily always organized by a centralized hierarchical force that, organizations tend to, present as such. Specifically in that period, and even in the second Intifada, and until today, though, in the West Bank, that's mostly the case, in a sense that people try to figure out ways through their kinship groups and through their friends to defy the Israeli military and the settler presence in Palestine. And that took me towards also thinking what friendship is, and it also took me to another way of also explaining perhaps also what happens when friendship fails in these cells. What happens when it breaks down, when people fail to affirm their friendship, when they confess on each other, or when they have a trauma. I think for many of the resistance fighters I met, um, what hurt was not the the torture in Israeli prison, or you know the isolation. What hurt, really hurt, and where people couldn't really speak is when they had a traumatic event with the people they trusted, when they had a failure of friendship, when they had a failure in affirming friendship. So there's another also traumatic story here that also somewhat explains a bit the baggage that comes with how also Palestinians in some cases turn from a belief in resistance towards disenchantment with it, a belief in the ability of resistance to open the political possibilities towards this trauma of that is interpolated within their own subjectivity, where there's a shattering experience, and where people recalibrate their own relationship to the world in a different way, or choose silence, or even choose to become completely against resistance in many instances, or work even for the forces that are against resistance. So this failure of friendship is also was would become very interesting to me and very central to my research as well. Whether it's in providing the genesis for one of the basic social institutions of how cells were formed through this affinity with friendship, or whether also what happens when friendship fails, or when the affirmation of friendship fails, and how that leaves a big gap in people's own narrative and self narrative, and how it ends up also explaining why some Palestinians, even though they have a nationalist history, how they became, operating in security forces that now capture resistance fighters, no? Or that torture resistance fighters now in the West Bank, for instance. So yeah, I mean, that's why I think friendship is central, and I think within Palestinian society, it's always been the case. I mean, some people would also come and you will try to explain to somebody why a specific village is all leftists, no, and you can't explain it because the village next to it is all, for example, or mostly I don't know, Islamist. And then you come, what happened here socially for the these two close villages to have one a very leftist presence and the other has a more Islamist presence. And then you end up also that in large part in these small rural communities, for instance, if one person that is well respected in that society, loved, people trust, and for some reason was a leftist, then the village slowly historically became leftist when the other village so that form of intimate relationships are always central, even for political organizing, even for how credibility is built for one political party in a certain community or a certain camp in Palestine, or why or how people coalesce around specific cells, and who's excluded also from the cell, because sometimes friends have to choose the friend that cannot be part of the cell, and that creates a lot of problems as well and headaches. And because they're doing things and that guy is close to them, but so it provides for an interesting history that also has jokes and has traumatic events and has, so we can read, I guess, Palestinian resistance through the cells. And at some point I wanted to change my dissertation to a history of cells in Palestine and not do the second and first intifada, but I was too deep into it. But yeah, I mean, there's a theoretical thing around it, but it's not necessarily, at least in terms of explaining the centrality of it. Yeah.
Very interesting. So so I think where I want to go next is a little bit on you know the education, science, engineering. You and I talked about this a little bit. You talk about it a little bit on the brief podcast as well. Um, of like, and I've been thinking about this since you explained it to me a lot, because one of the things that you talk about is that leftists, that we often are interested in the social sciences. We're interested in learning how to do political economy. Maybe we're attracted to the humanities and art and things like that. And for some reason, we have these affinity with these things. And some of it, I think, makes sense. I mean, a lot of us are influenced by like Marx. And, obviously we think about, the way that he did his work, or, Lenin, or whatever. And obviously, there's a lot of great cultural workers, right, that come from leftist backgrounds, and so we're attached to that work, and kind of maybe want to follow in the footsteps of that, or share it, learn how to do those types of theorizations, that type of academic work. Um, but you talk about, for instance, Hamas's attraction to the sciences and to engineering in particular. And, I mean, when we look at the capabilities that Palestinian resistance has developed, especially over the last few years, I mean, obviously, it's of course, it's still completely asymmetrical. Of course, Israel has more technology and more power, but there's a strong development of, um, a scientific ability, right, to enact, to use long range rockets, to figure out ways to, at times, get rockets through the so-called, Iron Dome, and so on. And so, um, I don't know where you want to take this, but I just would love to hear you talk a little bit more about these affinities to, and obviously the sort of logical sense that it draws. Where, I mean, after you told this to me, I was like, man, we need to get more leftists in the United States into like engineering and science. Like, but anyways, go ahead.
I mean, it comes out of, again, it comes out of the practical. If you want to do a struggle, you need to have practical skills. I mean, it's not always just one big lecture, and you need to actually have skills in using weapons, for instance, or training for them, or developing. I mean, I'm not trying to say, or say that only Hamas had that in Palestinian society. Of course not. I mean, Fatah also invested in engineering, for instance, in its historical experience in the Shatat, or the diaspora. I mean, there's always been an affinity with engineering, and it actually comes from an eerie place, because for a lot of the Islamists, they see in social sciences and critical theory and philosophy, as part of a cultural malaise, because Islam should be the doctrine. And for many, these type of studies are Western, it's part of Western imperialism. It's trying to infiltrate the culture of our societies, and there's a big also struggle around that. So that knack to not go for social sciences has more to do with also this background, ideological background, that dismisses any type of metaphysical thinking or any type of critical thinking, because the doctrine is already present, and it's embodied in Islam itself. And it comes, I mean, people like Sayyid Qutb, for instance, one of the most important, or I'm not sure if the most important, but one of the important figures in the Islamist his intellectual scene, let's put it that way, would incite people to do only science. He would say that the only legitimate study is science and technology, but metaphysical, or these other things should not be broached. So in Birzeit University, if you ever come to Birzeit, for instance, and you walk in the university, even where the Islamists would gather socially is close to the engineering or the science department mostly, and then you have the liberals and the leftists close to the arts and design schools, and it's not a very strict division, but has been historically the case, even in the spatial, where people encounter each other, or where they hang out, and where the Islamists hang out, and where the leftists hang out, and where the liberals hang out. There's like a spatial separation, which ties that affinity. So in many ways, that has to do with this kind of ideological bedrock that Islamists have, where engineering plays a big important role. But having said that, an engineer is, one, when you learn engineering, you're learning applied science, no? And supposedly engineers should solve social problems. And to solve social problems, they're supposed to, use ready at hand material, use their technical know-how, their knowledge of the sciences, and also their this knack for application and practicality to create, I don't know, new possibilities, new infrastructure, whatever it is, civil engineering, mechanical, electric, whatever it is. So, for instance, one of the main figures in the 1990s in the Islamist constellation of resistance was an engineer from the Birzeit University called Yahya Ayyash. And he reads a chemistry book in the university, and also has, an electrical engineering degree. And, through this mix of chemistry and electricity, he devises one of the first improvised explosive devices in Palestinian struggle. It's not the only one, but he devises it from ready at hand material from the Palestinian market that you can gather and then turn it into an explosive that can be actually used either as a human bomb, or in the beginning it was actually, there was an attempt at remote bombing, and then that didn't really work. The material was not working well with the early cells. There's a lot of risk for the explosives to be found out. They turn into this istishhadi model where, the human bomb, the mix between the human and the bomb becomes an important, and where you have the ballisticity of the bomb being carried by the person and then going and hitting a target, depending on where the target or what target did the resistance cells at that moment decide to target. So, from the beginning, in terms of the Islamist resistance in Palestine, that emphasis on engineering creativity, on, trying to devise weapons, small, simple, capable of also impacting, the Israeli society, Israeli military, etc., was always in the work. I mean, through these simple, material that existed in the Palestinian market, for instance, in the creation of the human bomb, that becomes the most predominant weapon in the Second Intifada and also in the 1990s. And, at that moment, historically speaking, it has been really over-culturalized, as, most analysis. I talked to that with John Elmer, and, a lot of emphasis, because it crisscrosses with 9/11, and there's this whole Islam versus the West, or, thesis of the clash of civilization, and how Islam is a cult of death and stuff like that. So it becomes embroiled mostly in culturalist explanations of this figure that rose in Palestinian society as a figure of self-sacrifice, called the istishhadi, which comes from the word shaheed. We talked about it earlier. It's martyr, but istishhadi in Arabic, when you say istishhadi, somebody still, seeking martyrdom, somebody seeking martyrdom, not somebody who was already martyred. And of course, the istishhadi also is trying to vie in terms of its conception with another form of self-sacrifice called the Fida'i, which is tied to Fatah, the nationalist secular group that devised this notion of Fida'i, of Palestinians fighters that infiltrated Israeli territory and conducted attacks within it in the 1970s, 60s, 50s, and 80s. So the Islamists had to, also bring their own model into the fold, also through this kind of competition that exists between the nationalist seculars and the Islamists, where the figure of the istishhadi comes to life through this mix of engineering, electricity, and chemistry, ready at hand material in the Palestinian markets. A Birzeit engineer from the Islamist group called Yahya Ayyash bringing about this weapon, and then it becomes a blueprint where cells were formed around it. mostly Ayyash would spend his time either teaching people how to do it, how to do the formula that he conducted, or enacting these explosives. And then most of the Islamist cells would be constructed around the know-how for this bombing and how to conduct it. So everybody was called at some point an engineer, even though they were not engineers. So I mean, they didn't have a degree in engineering, but because they learned it, they know the know-how. It became that. And now that's one part or small part of the story, because that just sustains itself throughout the 1990s and 2000s, and then going all the way to 7th of October, in the sense of a deep investment in engineering, in technical know-how. We're seeing it today in terms of, for example, Yasin 105. We're seeing it today in terms of the rocket barrages that go into Israel. We're seeing it today in terms of engineering, the tunnel network and how it's conceived, and how it's built within its specific context. I'm not I'm not an engineering expert here, but all of this, the resistance in Palestine and specifically in Gaza, cannot be dissociated from engineering in its important and fundamental and central role, including weapons, reverse engineering of weapons, including relations with other engineers across also the Arab world, know-how being transferred from other groups as well, and Iran, etc. But there's also a lot of it is also what indigenous, in a sense of being self-developed and created within the Gaza Strip itself, and has a lot to do with his emphasis on the engineering model. So that continues, and it continues with major figures. I don't want to go through the history, people like Al Ghul, which you hear about, the sniping weapon that Hamas has also created. Adnan Al Ghul was an important engineer in, for instance, the Qassam brigades. There's a long history of people who are known and unknown that have to do a lot with engineering and with testing ways, for example, to infiltrate or penetrate the Iron Dome through the use of rockets that use fibers. And it becomes very complicated and technical in terms of how also the Palestinian engineers are in a fight with the Israeli engineers. And each one is trying to devise a way to circumvent the other's weapons, and there's this kind of tactical but also duel that is happening in terms of inventiveness, creativity of the types of weapon that are used, how they're developed, and what can be made. So there's we can read the history of the struggle through how Israel armored its first vehicles, and then how Hezbollah, for instance, found a way to penetrate that armor, and then it armed it in a different way, and then it created systems to protect it from the Cornet missiles, and how now there's a way to circumvent these systems or to hit in a weak spot. Or so this is a long history of a give and take, a dialectical give and take between Israeli engineering and marvels, and also the resistance engineering and weaponry that is attempting to break Israeli engineering, and vice versa. Yeah, I mean, we can talk about it more. I'm happy to do so as well.
Yeah, I mean, anything that you really want to share. The thing I was gonna say is just, folks, if you do have other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Um, one of the things that, I guess, one of the other questions I wanted to ask. Again, you talked about this with John on the brief, but um, this discussion of, like, I mean, I think a lot of people have seen this. There's been polls that have been done, that demonstrate, how popular resistance is in Palestine. And, and it's interesting in some ways, like, weighing it out, because, like, I know that Hamas's popularity, it shifts over different time and things like this. But also it's interesting that the resistance groups, right? Qassam, in this instance, like, has even greater popularity, for instance, than Hamas as, like, a political organization. And you've talked already about the high price to pay, and certainly um there's no time that's more illustrative of that than currently. And yet it doesn't seem to um diminish, at least, people's um support of the idea of resistance and the importance of resistance. And so I wondered if you could help make sense of that to people who, it doesn't make sense to.
I mean, I think it, if you have some sort of empathy, the ability to place yourself in the position of being a Palestinian or living in Palestine as a Palestinian, is that, when you're humiliated and dominated and rendered in your daily life, as well as, shackled, that the notion of resistance is just a natural reaction. Nobody looks at it and says, "Oh, this is a weird phenomena, eerie." It has a very elementary element to it, is that, somebody's taking over my land and replacing my own existence, controlling my life, controlling my flow, my freedom of movement, my, and in many ways attempting to erase my own presence, whether historically, politically, whatever it is. And, so for Palestinians, the idea of resistance is just a natural, almost reaction to being in this condition. It's like being in an elevator with somebody who's growing fat all the time and choking you, and, and in many ways that's how, settler colonialism expands, replaces, confines, less Arab on less land, more settlements on larger swaths of land. So that is a process that we see daily in our lives, just moving around our cities, and also through the historical experience of a Nakba, and listening to our grandparents, and knowing that we live in this horizon, that, what should we do, what's the, that's the question that, anybody would ask. And of course there's different strategies. Some people would say, let's immigrate as a, form of individual salvation. I'll leave Palestine and just carry, or care about my own personal life. And, some Palestinians do that. Some Palestinians choose to remain in Palestine, but also to not, necessarily proactively resist. But as I just explained earlier, thinking that just being here is a form of, meaning, and resistance, and just, staying, trying to figure out a way to raise a family or live a normal life as much as possible within the confines of this settler state. Others, will think, look, the only way I'm going to be free is to resist. And, resistance is about, beyond its elementary, reaction to this expansion, it's also about, as we said earlier, it's about building this hope that, you can live as fully human without being controlled by somebody else. So it's as normal as that. And that's why, of course, historically, there's a lot of hyperbole and jargon around Palestinian resistance. And it doesn't mean we have to agree with everything that Palestinian resistance conceives of or does, or we think that, there's no ethical quandaries for this resistance. But also for me, what is important is that people understand, if you want to make an ethical or moral judgment, you have to also make it through the choices that are being made in the embodied historical, experience of Palestine. So, and Israel propaganda is really well at, telling you that Palestinians hate Jews and they're out to kill Jews, and, we have a problem with the Jewish people, or we have a problem with what, so we're driven by hate, we're driven by being, the inheritors of Nazism, or, there's that type of jargon that always existed, propaganda that always existed in the West, that attempts to turn this very natural reaction that anybody in any place in the world would have the same reaction. A lot of societies resisted colonialism. All societies that had colonialism resisted, at least parts of them resisted. Some of them failed, some of them succeeded. Maybe not total failure or total success in many cases as well. So in many instances, it's a natural reaction. So the idea for me that that many Palestinians as well fear to talk about resistance is one of the things that I, take also offense at. I think that maybe mainstream media is not receptive. Maybe a lot of people will tie Palestinian resistance to this fighting institution that is too controversial because it was built as such. But I think anybody who wants to understand, the Palestinian experience and wants to only render Palestinians as either helpless victims or as human rights case law or as will miss the fact that it is resistance that created the modern Palestinian identity. It is resistance that sustained Palestinians on their land. It is resistance and also its efficacy through time that problematized the Israeli state, creating more contradictions within it. And right now, and despite all the sacrifices and the highly vulnerable life that Palestinians in Gaza are living, and even in the West Bank as well, although to a lesser extent, you know, Israel is in a strategic bind. Palestine is an issue once again, is the issue once again. What should it do in terms of its inability to defeat the resistance or deal it a blow, and at the same time, losing soldiers, still having Israeli held as prisoners among the resistant fighters, having multiple fronts to deal with, having American unwillingness to go for a regional war. So there's a lot of, there's a strategic bind that this, we don't know what happens eventually. But at least from learning even the history of peace processes, even the history of, support for the Palestinian cause across the world. And, every time, 1973, the Egyptians crossed the Suez Canal, you had Egypt retaining, control of Sinai again in 1978 through a peace agreement with Israel. No, in the first Intifada leads to also not the biggest, accomplishment, but also it forced Israel to rethink its own, settler colonialism at that moment. The second Intifada produced an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza in terms of its settler presence, or the settlement and the settlers' presence in Gaza, and also produced a withdrawal from Jenin area. So, I mean, whatever we look at history, we see a direct, even in Nakba, 1970, in 1948, the fact that the West Bank and Gaza remain are also partially a product of the resistance that existed at that moment, whether in Arab armies or that in many Palestinian state has to do with that. So the history also tells us that the reason why Palestinians remain relevant and why they remain an issue and why they remain steadfast has to do with their long historical and long durée resistance that they have been conducted through almost a century. So, I mean, yeah, I don't think for Palestinians resistance is a controversial issue. Even people within Palestine that speak, against resistance, either they speak about some tactical, problem that they don't like, or some ethical dilemma that they don't appreciate, or they debate, the reaction of Israel. They don't debate the resistance itself. So they start tying what resistance did to how Israel reacted. Somewhat, sometimes, also, unfortunately, holding the resistance responsible for Israeli reaction. I mean, this is an important issue. It's not. I mean, Israel could have reacted in many different ways. For instance, for 7th of October, including a different form of warfare, including attempting to not kill civilians, including it reacted the way it reacted because already embodied within it is this desire to get rid of the Palestinians. Already embodied within its ideology is desire to eradicate our presence. It didn't react that because it was just provoked by one attack. This is already so ingrained that when that attack rose, it became an opportunity to go on with this program of slaughter, not because they want to deter or burn consciousness, as if this worked. After 75 years from a Nakba and after 100 years of struggle, you still talk about burning in the Palestinian conscience that they defeated people and that it didn't work. It didn't work. I mean, people always celebrate Israel because it learns from its history and mistakes. It doesn't. It doesn't learn anything. I mean, it has this unwillingness to actually learn because it relishes in its own superiority. It relishes in its own dominion and control. it doesn't have the willingness to actually find a political solution, for instance, to break down its racialized system, to break down its control of economic fortune of the Palestinians, to allow Palestinians to live in a free and respectable manner without being held by the barrel of their gun. I mean, that is not the lesson they learn. They think every solution has a military solution, no? But that at some point that extinguishes itself, and Israel will have to come to recognize its own limits and the limits of its power and the extent of it. I'm not saying it will do this time, but I think people exaggerate Israel's ability to learn from its mistakes. I don't think it does. I mean, I think um, it's a form of a stupid repetition of the same mistake of dealing with the Palestinians for the past 100 years. And as I said, always, even if this war, for instance, doesn't provide us with a new horizon or whatever it is in terms of its immediate, at least, outcomes, um, you know, there's not going to be a total defeat of the Palestinian people. It's not going to happen. Uh, Intergenerationally, politically speaking, we will raise our children to remember, to fight, to sustain, to find opportunities. We will teach them about Palestine. We'll continue to do that, because it's such a grave injustice, and because we're a proud people that have a deep connection to the place we come from, and because it's just not right, and we will do whatever is necessary to gain our liberation. Yeah.
Awesome. Appreciate that. There's some folks who have put some questions in the chat, so I'm gonna pull them up for you. So this is there's a character limit, so these are like I have to show two comments to get the full question. But the question asks, Gaza resistance is a combination of Islamist and leftist groups. Of course, I think alluding to the inclusion of like the PFLP, wondering if there's a tension that exists and how they overcome. Also curious about how specializing in hard sciences versus humanity, I think she clarified later, affects strategy rather than tactics, either currently or in the past. I'm interested if you have any thoughts on those.
Sure. I mean, there's always been tensions among Palestinians, among the various, let's say, ideological constellations that exist politically in Palestine, including leftist, nationalist, secularist, like Fatah, or Islamist, like in the case of Hamas. Islamic Jihad is a special case because it's a political party that comes out of the PLO at the same time out of the Islamists in the same moment. So it's a combination of people who were influenced by the Iranian Revolution, and also the Islamic Brotherhood, and they come together and they organize what is now known as the Islamic Jihad as a political party. Now in Gaza, there's many political dispositions in terms of the resistance groups. Most predominant is Hamas. Just for people for it to be clear, I mean, nobody really competes with them in a way that provides any threat on Hamas's political grounding in Gaza in terms of its social base or in terms of its hold or control of the Gaza Strip, at least in the past 16 years or so. Now, because there's different ideological constellations, there's always different, mobilization strategies for these political groups and different, programs for how they expanded within Palestinian society. So, for instance, Hamas, the reason why it's a big political constellation, not only because it has this focus on Islam, but because it worked in charity organizations, in building, a lot of civic institutions, in operating within mosques, and producing the mosque or operating within mosque as a space for also its own ideological orientation, and attempting to attract people to its political party, etc. So Hamas, in many ways, operated through a war of position, like what Gramsci would say is a war of position, in building institutions, building their own charity organization, building their own, presence in the mosques, taking over mosques in certain areas. There's a struggle over mosques in Palestine, and also sometimes churches as well. Who holds the Rhine in this mosque, or which political party, has the imam of the mosque. So it's a war of position among different political parties, etc. So that's one of the elements that provided Hamas with a big social base from which to build its own political, social, and military program. And as Jared, you were saying, yeah, I mean, the most popular for most people, for most Palestinians, is only the resistance, less the political, less the ideological, let's say, orientation of Hamas. I mean, Palestinians now, if they do support Hamas, it's not because they're Hamas necessarily or belong to the Hamas political group, is because they see Hamas as the spearhead in the Palestinian resistance, and therefore as the one managing now the nationalist cause and opening the political possibilities for it through this resistance. And that's why the resistance is more popular. Now, have there been tensions? Of course, there have been tensions historically, sometimes even fights in many cases, sometimes a lack of coordination, if you want. But generally speaking, there are two ways these fights, let's say, build their own grammar. So in one instance, there's a politics of what we can call muzawada. In Arabic, muzawada mean, kind of rhetorical surpassing of the other. So if you say something, I say something to outdo you, to out radicalize you. And what I mean by politics of muzawada is that political parties generally fight by telling the other one that you're not doing resistance enough, or you're not doing it well, or you betrayed the cause, or so they point to the other and they say that, I'm outdoing you in terms of how we fight. So there's internal contradiction. If you want to take the Maoists, for example, sorry, the primary contradiction and the secondary contradictions, that in most instances, Palestinian resistance groups would attempt to compete through outdoing each other in relation to their struggle against Israel. So that's how they outcompete each other, and how they deal or manage, in many instances, their struggle over, ideological hegemony within Palestinian society or otherwise. That's one instance. In some instances, unfortunately, it turned towards a redefinition of the enemy and friend within Palestinian society. For instance, now we have a political formation like the Palestinian Authority that took cooperation with Israel to salvage a political class, an economic elite in the West Bank as its mode of political operation. Therefore, if you're now cooperating with Israel on security and civic and financial flows, etc., as a comprador class, and you're a political nationalist party historically like Fatah, how can you justify that without also redefining who the enemy and the friend is? So what in many ways this elite did, or this comprador class did, is it turned Hamas, the internal, let's say, outbidder, the internal competitor, to the enemy. It didn't turn Israel to a friend necessarily, but it turned it into an enemy that cannot be defeated. So in many ways, it turned it to this distant enemy that cannot be defeated. Therefore, I'm cooperating with it, while Hamas is the enemy that I can actually defeat. So it reflects some sort of also psychological process tied to what Fanon say, is, a brother killing his own brother, form of murder. When you cannot produce an antagonism towards the settler colonial state, that antagonism becomes internalized, and people start, killing each other, and you have violence, begetting violence within the same community or within the same fold as well. So that's when it comes to Fatah. Now, when it comes to leftists in Gaza and the Islamists, there's a longer history, specifically in the 80s, where the leftists were a larger political force in Palestinian society, perhaps the biggest political forces, specifically in the occupied territories. And slowly, of course, with the fall of the Soviet Union, with the turn of a lot of Palestinian leftists, unfortunately, towards the NGOization of their political work, turning to NGOs that were also captured by financial flows that are coming from Europe and the United States. And there's a long history of also how these financial flows are contingent on political condemnation or in operating within a specific set of conditionalities, etc. So that a lot of the left turned towards NGOs or civil society. They were internal opposition to the PA project, the Palestinian Authority project, but also they were not a radical opposition to it in many instances. I'm not talking about the whole left, but in most instances we can say that they were a pliant opposition. That has unfortunately led, I mean, there's a lot of other factors that come into it, but it led to the downsides of the leftists in Palestinian society and their political impact, at least when it comes to their own ability to attract people to their own resistance project. The formation of cells, the formation of political organization. Now, I'm not trying to dismiss the importance of the left in Gaza. It exists and it operates. It has Israeli also prisoners that they're holding right now. It's part of the constellation of resistance. But, because of the relative size of each group, the tensions have been reduced. The left cannot really launch a challenge against Hamas, and Hamas doesn't really view the left as a big challenge to its rule or hold over Gaza or its own resistance project. So in many instances, they also meet on their antagonism towards the PA and its current leadership. So that provided also for some sort of channeling of a relationship where they actually work together, coordinate together, and have largely good relationships. So I mean, despite the tensions, there's also good relationship, at least for now. Because as many Palestinians will joke, right now we're you could be unified towards liberating Palestine, but we're all joking that after the liberation, if that ever happens, then we'll start killing each other more. I mean, that will go into a civil war on ideological and political front. So that these antagonisms are kind of delayed and postponed, although I don't think they are. As I try to lay it out, they're also part and parcel of how the resistance communicate with each other through outdoing or through in some instances also turning against each other or coordinating and working together. But there's more of a history of coordination and working together than I think than there is a history of competition and outdoing each other. Despite that, the primary wisdom of most readings will actually just point to competition. So just so you be placed at least in this historical context. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was listening. I don't even remember what it was. You and I've talked about how like there's very little that's written on in English on Palestinian resistance, and most of what you can find is from folks that are, of course, antagonistic to the idea of Palestinian resistance. Counterterrorism books and things like this, and um, so I was listening to one of these. I don't even remember who it was from, but it was from some, um, you know, group that I consider completely ideologically aligned with, like the Pentagon, right? That was basically, talking about history and the state of Palestinian resistance. And this was probably a few years ago. I want to say it was probably 2018 or, somewhere in there, somewhere within the last 5 years. But they were, one of the things they talked about was something that you alluded to there, which was like this dynamic between, in their description of it, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, of like if Hamas stopped resisting and sort of, you know, not cooperated with Israel, right? But sort of has some, I don't know what the term is, maybe détente, right? Some sort of like um lack of resistance, but understanding like an acceptance of a certain state of conditions as they develop certain things or whatever. However that might be perceived and whatever they might be working on that people don't know about, that then Islamic Jihad, if they're pushing resistance in that time and are acting, then suddenly this shifts some popularity to them because people can see, oh, well, they're actually resisting and you're no longer resisting, right? And so I thought that was an interesting, dynamic, somewhat of what you're talking about in terms of like competition around resistance. I don't know if that was what you were alluding to or if that's even a good characterization of it.
No, I mean, yeah, I mean, many people would point out. I mean, that's what the ultimate Israeli desire is to kill the idea of resistance. No, so the idea of resistance is hard to kill, specifically when your own policy produces it. That's a problem. That's a contradiction with it. But the other element to it is that Islamic Jihad is a special case of a Palestinian political group because when it was built to be always a spearhead. It was built in terms of how the founding fathers of the Islamic Jihad, created this political group, or also to be purely committed to resistance, to be not interested in politics or ruled or hegemony ideologically within Palestinian society. That's why Islamic Jihad didn't invest that much in, for example, charity work, institutions, etc. From the beginning, it was a very vanguardist political organization built around networks of friends, sometimes built through the prison system itself. And Islamic Jihad is like, I would, it's akin to like people, revolutionaries sitting down, let's say in a closed circle, and somebody asks, "What should we do now?" or "Should we do it now?" And Islamic Jihad's answer is always now. Now we should do resistance now. It never has it doesn't it doesn't want to delay or say like, now we have conditions, let's build up, let's do. Its answer is always now, and it sees itself as always pushing even the other groups to be more committed to resistance or disrupting their detente with Israel, or so its claim even from the 80s since it's born is that it's always on the forefront of resistance. It's always the one pushing the limits. Sometimes of course, as like anybody else, if you want to like try to analogize it in a different way, when we were children, we'd always play these games, and you have that child that says, I can jump from this high wall and nothing will happen to me. Islamic Jihad is that kid, and it will jump from the wall, and sometimes it breaks its leg and ends up in the hospital or something like that. So Islamic Jihad has always had this history of pushing, and never saying, now it's time to like rest. Now it's time to, engage in other actions. And that's what made it, a special case in terms of Palestinian resistance groups. Not Palestinian resistance per se, as we said before, because resistance sometimes emanate from, outside any political constellation or a group. It emanates from the ecology, its interaction, people from their own cells, etc., as we spoke earlier. So in this instance, Islamic Jihad has that level of we're fully committed to resistance and pure resistance as such. While Hamas, for instance, as it governs Gaza, and it has commitment, financial commitments, and it has commitment towards the people of Gaza, as a governing body, it will be more reserved, and that's why for Israel for a long time thought that Hamas is deterred, because it has this economic equation. It has to ensure that its governance of Gaza continues undisrupted. It has to show. So they didn't think that Hamas would do something like 7th of October. And in fact, the Islamic Jihad action in the past 2 years helped entrench in Israel mentality that Hamas is deterred. And Hamas used those to not enter the war and allow Israel and Islamic Jihad to hit each other without intervening directly in the last two rounds that happened in the Gaza Strip. So there's an interesting dynamic when it comes to the Islamic Jihad. It's also an interesting special case in Palestinian history, a bit unlike others because it's only ideology. I mean, I know it's called Islamic Jihad, and I know people sometimes associate themselves within the Islamic Jihad with Islam as a cultural force of mobilization. Some have a more ideological outlook of what the Islam means in Islamic Jihad, but for ultimately it's a group that just sustains and wants to sustain this rhythm of resistance throughout the time. Its answer to what we should do now or what should be done is resist, resist, resist.
Yeah, appreciate that. So I'm not super familiar with this person's work, but this was a question. It's a two-parter. So I'm I'll say Weissman. I'm not going to even try. Idea of forensic architecture and Israel's Delusian war machine, useful in highlighting colonial violence in U.S. classrooms, but it exceptionalizes the Israeli war machine. Thoughts on this? The how to give an account of the field of war writ large to students who may come from these partial or partisan anti-Palestinian backgrounds. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with that person's work that's being referenced or these questions, but yeah, go ahead.
What's the second question?
It's really just, I think, related. So the question was,
yeah, I know the first question. Let me answer Eyal Weizman. I think, look, Eyal Weizman is, in his book Hollow Land, specifically where he talks about the Israeli war machine, using this Delusian lexicon. To be fair to Eyal actually looked at what a lot of the Israeli research institutions were talking about themselves. So, interesting enough, at some point, the Israeli military, some of its own intellectual, let's say, leaders, although Israelis tend to pride themselves of being a non-intellectual military organization, a practical one that learns on the fly, and its credibility comes from the direct experience of warfare rather than theory or excessive intellectual discourses around war. But in the 2000s, there was this Rotary Institute headed by somebody called Shimon Neve and people like Aviv Kochavi, who was before the current chief of staff of the Israeli military, also the chief of staff of Israel's military. They prided themselves of being sort of these soldier philosophers types. And they appropriated some of the idioms of critical theory and people like Deleuze and Guattari in understanding, movement within, urban terrain and urban warfare. So, for instance, Kochavi is famously known to have created this notion of an inverted geometry where the Israeli military, instead of moving through the streets, would move through the homes themselves, opening walls within the homes. And then the troop movement would all be hidden from the streets, so that Palestinian resistance will not see the troops. They will only, be surprised or being pushed by, Israel's infiltration of, dense urban Palestinian spaces like refugee camp of Balata and the old city of Nablus, by them entering through the walls of people's houses and homes, going from one home to another. These are close home, built next to each other, so you can, enter through this holes. Now, the thing about Deleuze's own project, it's a bit different. It says like the war machine is distinct from the state. It's actually anti-status, no? And Deleuze's emphasis is that the war machine actually wants to disrupt any form of state. Pneumatic, it's it operates on the level that is always a force antagonistic towards the state, but at the same time, a state could appropriate it. So you could say that at some level, Israel's war machine as being explained through Eyal Weizman, and this form of walking through the wall or other practices that it devised in its urban operations, we could echo some of Deleuze's, I don't know, theoretical underpinning. But I think, first of all, Deleuze would probably, kill himself in his grave if he knew that Israel is using his own theoretical, because Deleuze was known to be a very big supporter of Palestinian rights. Whatever we think about him theoretically, he was one of the most outspoken French intellectuals of his era on Palestinian rights. But the second thing, and I think is important, that the walking through the wall strategy was actually devised by Palestinians and then appropriated by Israel. So I mean, just historically speaking, Palestinians used this. Other people used it before the Israeli military used it, also in other places. I think, not sure where. I don't want to like do a mistake now here, but but from my reading also that other people used it before. But Israel used it as a way to rebrand itself. Look at us, how we devise this troop movement, this inverted geometry. We're giving it this critical dressing. We're giving it this sophisticated, theoretical jargon. Although in some of the operations that Palestinians actually conducted within the Second Intifada by engineers from the Islamic Jihad, for instance, in the old city of Hebron, where 12 soldiers were killed in that operation, they used, a hole in the wall to move through different vintages and angles to target these Israeli militaries in a well placed ambush that again left, I think, 11 or 12 Israeli soldiers killed. And so it's important just to contextualize that. Eyal doesn't mention that, but to contextualize that a lot of actually what Israel prides itself in has also roots, or have been tactics that were devised actually by Palestinian resistance itself. Now there is, you can credit the Israelis of seeing that and turning it into an inverted geometry, but Eyal, being an Israeli himself, a critical Israeli, one who's against the occupation, etc., but he was critiquing. He had this critical stance towards, trying to write about the architecture of the occupation and its military and its different dispositions. So it's a good book, generally speaking. I'm not, against this book, but I think he fails to mention that historical fact. Other than that, I don't see it. I don't see this delusion, this Israeli fascination or intellectual fascination with Deleuze as anything other than attempting to give something very simple a much more complicated theoretical jargon, and trying to build up too much Israel's creativity and military planning or troop movements as part of also Israel's disposition to be a place for training of militaries and sharing of experiences, and so it's something like that. Surprisingly enough, actually, the Rotary Institute was dismissed by the Israeli military after the 2006 war, when Hezbollah gave a bloody bleeding to the Israeli military, and where troop movements within the southern Lebanon failed completely in front of Hezbollah's, demolishment of the tanks, etc. And actually, a lot of that Deleuzian jargon was accused of being the reason for why Israel failed in its ground maneuver in southern Lebanon. This fixation on philosophy and theoretical jargon, because people didn't understand. The commanders didn't understand what their top lieutenants and generals wanted them to do by this overcomplexifying of language and jargon, etc. So I mean, just also a note that even Israel itself at some point decided that that was actually Achilles' heel in its own warfighting capacities, and yeah.
Right on. There's two left. I'll ask, and then we'll let you out of here to get on with your day. Um, One is a fairly, one of these difficult but also understandably meaningful questions of, would be interested in hearing your thinking, your theory on how Palestinian liberation can be achieved. What are some necessary steps and preconditions? Let's just do that one first because the other one's a little bit different.
Well, I mean, look, that's a difficult question to really answer in a. I wish I had like a complete answer. That would need a much more wider rendition. But just generally speaking, from historical experiences of case studies, and you guys, a lot of you would know also a lot of these cases, so I don't have to go into them. What I think was central in many of the experiences of people liberating themselves from settler colonialism was that at some point, because of the cost of continuing the same policy for the elites and the military leaders of the nations doing the colonialism, becomes expensive, tiring, and morally bankrupting. There's economic boycotts, or in different cases, there's different contingencies. But eventually, within the consciousness of the colonialist himself, there's an inability to complete or to continue with the same political military disposition. So liberation for a lot of the oppressed people around the world was to use these tools to organize them, to organize their rhythms in order to convince, in through the language of force, uh, not through dialogue, but through the language of force, that the oppressor, that they cannot continue with their oppression, that they need to, rethink their own policy, disposition, etc. And I think um, that is what Palestinian resistance is attempting to do in many ways. Nobody thinks really that you can have one maneuver within Israeli territory and then, completely disrupt the state and destroy it. Perhaps, maybe that's something that is possible. I don't know, but I think a guerrilla fighting force, operates on a level of, in this case, to burn in the consciousness of Israelis that they cannot continue with the same racialized system, their policy of oppression, their total domination of the land, their denial of Palestinian rights, and that the only way forward is for a political solution. So that includes, a political backing from the world. It includes alliances with, other groups across the globe. It includes boycotts. It includes ICJ, and the moral fight and the public relations fight, and it includes all the different levels. Um, that is one element of how you can reach that uh, uh, end. The only problem has always been with Palestinians is sometimes their political leadership fails them. They have more leverage and they don't use that leverage, or due to our being shattered into the diaspora, due to like people trying to survive no matter what in terms of political power, sometimes that has been our own Achilles heel, if you want, has been our own tragic, sometimes unfurling. Sometimes we have daring resistance, we have a good infrastructure in terms of global support, solidarity, etc. But at the same time, our own leadership or people who are in command, uh, you know, at some level, would choose to conduct counterproductive policies or otherwise. But I do see the Palestinian struggle as still a long-term one. I don't think, for instance, this fight will liberate Palestine. I don't think that we will have, maybe something will come out of it on a political level. I don't know. And maybe it's a worse thing than what used to be before. It's also possible. Maybe it's much better than what used to be before as well. That's also possible. But yeah, I mean, that's my own thinking of how liberation is when those in power conclude that there's a limitation on their power, that the cost of continuing with the same policy cannot persist. And did we reach that with Israel thus far? No. I mean, it's not the case. But that is one element. Some would say maybe one instant maneuver inside would liberate Palestine, although I doubt it. I don't think that's a realistic scenario, but I might be wrong. So who knows?
No, I appreciate that. So this is a question, it kind of relates to what I talked to you about a little earlier, and we've talked about before about like the lack of um, good literature that deals with Palestinian resistance in English. But someone asked, I'm still learning about the Palestinian resistance. Do you have any comments on the book Son of Hamas? Um, and are there better books to read?
Yeah, I mean, Son of Hamas is a book by somebody called Mus'ab Hassan Youssef, who actually doesn't, who used to live not very far from where I live. And he is the son of one of the leaders of Hamas. And in the second Intifada, he became a collaborator with the Israeli Shabak, which is the Israeli intelligence organization that deals with Palestinians. Very and he had to leave Palestine because Palestinians don't necessarily treat kindly people who collaborate with the Israelis, on a level of also like he participated in providing information and the killing, I think, of people and resistance fighters. So he left and he was given asylum by the US, and he became a Christian evangelist and a propagandist for Israel. He's a very disturbed individual, to say the least. And part of his, let's say, I don't know if it's genuine or it's part of how he operates in terms of, financial, I don't know, gains or whatever it is. I don't want to speak to the person himself, but he's been very outspoken on, being kind of this Palestinian face to a policy that supports Israel's genocide in Gaza and etc. I don't think you will learn a lot about Palestinian resistance reading that book. It demonizes. It's a book meant to demonize Hamas, meant to demonize the organization, and it's written generally for an audience that wants this kind of thriller about a Muslim who becomes a Christian, the son of Hamas leader that becomes an evangelist. So there's that kind of element of suspense around it, and Israel uses some of these Palestinians as propaganda tools to try and justify its own fight against the Palestinians. It's also very important to just note here, Israel generally tends to focus in its propaganda campaign on, for instance, saying Hamas or saying, for instance, historically PLO. It never talks about, for example, its war on the Palestinians and its war on Palestine. So it always takes, first of all, because it doesn't recognize, it doesn't want to recognize that there are Palestinians in Palestine who have the most rightful claim to Palestine. And second of all, because it tends to want to demonize and associate always political groups with terrorism, with political violence, and in an attempt to, completely make them diabolical. And for this instance, Son of Hamas is one of those books that, supposedly comes from an authentic experience of a Palestinian who was turned into a collaborator at a young age by the Israeli Shabak. And of course, Mus'ab explains that no, it was an ideological change. I went to the Israeli side because I changed my idea. But actually, I think he's a victim of the Israeli occupation in many ways, a victim of being placed, being born in a family where his father has to go to prison all the time. A very tragic, unfolding of, remember Palestinians when they collaborate with their oppressors, even in terms of, security collaboration, there's a long history of that as well. And that history is, something that Palestinians tend to not talk about for a lot of reasons, a lot of sensitivity around family issues, around shame, and so we tend to not talk about it too much. But people are sometimes embezzled in prison, or if in a very conservative society, if you have like a sexual orientation that is different than the society, that could be worked against you if you're gay or lesbian, or that could be brought up. That's why they ask also if you're married or not in the first interrogation session, assessing why you're not getting married, and perhaps finding out if you have a sexual orientation that they can use against you. Things like that. I mean, there's a long history of why Palestinians end up as collaborators, not but it's very little for ideological reasons. It's really very little because, well, oh, I believe in Zionism. It's not like, for instance, a lot of, let's say, the ex-Zionists you see that become anti-Zionist in the Jewish world, for instance, or in the Israeli world. People who grew up in Zionist households or were Zionists and unlearned in Zionism, and we see a lot of them now speaking on the media about their own experience of how they unlearned Zionism and how they became opposed to Israel. It's not, doesn't come from a privileged position. That form of collaboration is also, it also reveals the discrepancy in power, because when you collaborate, collaborate under duress or through embezzlement, or because you want to survive something, or because you want some access to healthcare, or because you're in that weak position where you can be turned into somebody that turns against his own people, or something like that. It doesn't come from a moment of epiphany where you unlearn your Palestinianism and you believe in the Zionist project in a way that makes you have an affinity with it, or any, although there are some of those um, for a lot of other different reasons, but we can talk about it later. But with Mus'ab's case, we're talking about that level of a Palestinian who was a son of a very respected leader here, who's always in prison, and he was, at some level became a collaborator, had to leave Palestine, wrote this book. So no, you will not learn from that book that much.
Are there others you would recommend? I mean, one thing we'll at some point we have to let you get back to working on your thesis so that you can publish a book on it in English. But
So yeah, I mean, we'll see if I publish anything on it. But in English, I mean, there's not many on Palestinian resistance per se, in terms of how we were talking about it. But people could read, for instance, Yazid Sayer's work on armed struggle and the search for the state, as one book that gives an encyclopedic reading. Although I critique it highly. I don't like that reading, but it's an encyclopedic reading of the Palestinian Revolution from after the Nakba until 1993. And there are some interesting works on the first Intifada that people can read. There's also Rashid Khaldzi's work, just for general historical context. Also his latest book on settler colonialism, the 100 Years War on Palestine. But unfortunately, no, there's not much in terms of actual books that people can access with ease on the Palestinian resistance and its development, taking all these different angles that we were talking about. There's some articles, and as Jared was saying, a lot of the work on Palestinian resistance come from its enemies, not its supporters, unfortunately, or people that at least feel a sense of sympathy with it. Yeah.
Yeah, right on. Folks shouting out that they will read anything and everything that you write. So, but yeah, no, I agree. I mean, sometimes I like to read those right wing and militaristic sort of accounts of things because, there are certain. I mean, the funny thing is that sometimes, in certain ways, it's kind of like you talked about with Fauda, of like there's a certain way in which some of those accounts are more sympathetic than mainstream accounts. Like there's clearly an ideological disagreement, and there's also often this way that they'll just sort of dismiss everything within this kind of um, frame of terrorism, or try to psychoanalyze people and why they take certain things that don't take into any account sort of, you know, questions of liberation, questions of material conditions, etc. But on another level, they do actually look at some of the, I guess some of the nuts and bolts or like the blow by blow accounting of things in a way that can at least help you have some information and background that is often totally left out of a lot of the mainstream discussions. Oh, one last question I'll ask. Are you familiar with this book, Hamas Contained by Tariq Bakani?
Yeah, I mean, Tariq has a historical reading, not necessarily of resistance as an institution. Yeah, I mean, he has a reading, a political reading of the evolution of Hamas. He said Hamas moves from resistance towards a more contained posture that has to do with the responsibilities it took with governance. A lot of readings, not only Tariq's, talk about how Hamas, was in a bind in a sense of being a governing power in the Gaza Strip with all the responsibilities of what it means to be a governing power. So it's not a clandestine network. It's not a political organization that is operating in an urban terrain secretly or anything like that. It's the governing power itself, and how that being a governing power also means that you have to like take a larger view of things rather than a small group of clandestine operatives trying to disrupt or something like that. So in the evolution of Hamas, a lot of people read its entry towards politics and its governing of the Gaza Strip as a way to um, as a means through which it became more deterred, more contained politically in terms of its ambitions and the ideological zeal that it had in the 1990s and the Second Intifada. So yeah, I mean, Tariq's book is one of these books that attempts to trace that bind between a governance and between resistance, between resistance being a force for disruption, being like, if you want Deleuze to bring it, being that war machine, that nomadic power that disrupts state power, that disrupts settler colonialism, that opens crack within it despite any cost, and being at the same time a state institution. So there's that kind of duality. I don't mean it's a state in the fullest sense of the word, but it's being a state institution, a governing body. And to be honest, that was not only a bind when it comes to Hamas. Historically speaking, Fatah, a lot of the other dominant groups within Palestine had that. Fatah would build also institutions that resemble the state, even in Lebanon or, when they entered with the PA, etc. And then at certain specific moments, you would see an anti-status force from within the state itself. So that was always part of our own history, and a lot of people miss that in a sense that it's true that you build the institutions, but you also build the things that will destroy the same institutions that you actually constructed, and sometimes they operated against each other. In the case of Fatah in the Second Intifada, you had, for instance, Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades from Fatah that sometimes fought with some of the people from the PA that were more entrenched in preserving the PA and its institution and its cooperation with Israel. And you have, in the case of Hamas, also this reading where it traces it in a very evolutionist sense. And this is what I don't necessarily appreciate about Tariq's book, is that it kind of places Hamas in a contained way. And I think what happened in 7th of October kind of somewhat disrupts his own this evolutionist from one trend to another type of build-up, not putting them in relation together at the same time, and not seeing that kind of development and investment in resistance was happening. As Kant says, sometimes war happens because people prepare for war. And Hamas was always, as a political organization, preparing for war. So that huge investment in the war-making ability and not seeing it too well is also kind of unfortunate, and building this kind of evolutionist analytical model in his book. That I kind of don't like, but I think it gives a good overview of some of the dilemmas of Hamas and how it developed, and some of the symbolic concessions that it's also made, and its experience in governance. So yeah, in terms of that, it's a good book to read. and yeah, you should read it.
Right on. Appreciate all of that. We'll leave it there. And pick up another time and take on some other topics. So again, thank you for all of your time and for chatting with us again today.
Thank you, Jared. Happy to be with you guys.
Absolutely.